It looks like we are off and running. Nicole Lee, you are here with me. Thank you very much for joining me to have an enlightening conversation. I'm looking forward to this. As I look at the About Me page on NicoleLee.org, I see some very inspiring messaging, right? It talks about you being a human rights lawyer and some of the things you've done in your career. The last portion there says that what I learned from that work is that each of us can be brave, courageous, and visionary. And that's a message I can get behind, right? Being brave in the face of all of the things that are going on that we face in this world today, I think is very important. You go on to say, each of us can also give in to our worst fears and settle for the life we have rather than the life we want. And I think, boy, if I can't get behind that message, what can I? You are apparently, with your coaching and all the things you do, an inspiring person and an inspired person. Can you just start and tell the audience here, who are you and what's your mission?
Well, and some of it's really simple, and I guess some of what I am is more complicated. So I'm originally from Buffalo, New York, right, which has a lot to do with kind of my values and ethics. Buffalo's a really working class town, or it was when I was growing up, a really working class town, where people had to rely on each other. So we're known for our snow. So, you know, when you're caught in a snowbank, whoever's going to help you is going to be your friend. And that's a lot about Buffalo. Buffalo has an interesting history. Even I do a lot of work around racial justice, and it has a sketchy, difficult history around racial justice. And yet when I think about Buffalo and I think about snow and I think about the hard work, the ethics around hard work, that's really a lot of what makes me up. I grew up in Buffalo, but I really always had this vision of working internationally and working with people in countries in Africa and in Latin America and Europe. And I found my real passion around human rights. Even before I went to law school, I became a human rights lawyer, but even before going to law school, I found a real passion around working with people that were fighting for their rights and being a support to them. And so that made up a lot of who I was, a lot of my career, a lot of my ambition. And I did that work. And yeah, as you said, I found a lot of inspiration from the people that I worked with, and discovered that, you know, heroes aren't just folks that make the nightly news. It's the moms who, you know, have 5 kids and they're in the middle of like the worst natural disaster or man-made disaster of their lives. And they say, even though I have 5 kids, I'm going to take these 2 more because they've lost their mother. I mean, those are like real heroes. And to be faced with people who are willing to make those sacrifices and to take those risks day after day really kind of also formed me. It was kind of a new birth, a rebirth for me, and discovering that what really matters is when we feel like we can't dig deep, we actually do that. We dig deep again. When we feel like we're in a conversation that's uncomfortable, we work through it no matter what. And so really having that experience in human rights really helped me kind of rediscover what my purpose is and what my plan is. My real passion right now is working kind of one-on-one and with groups of people really around how can we do the best where we are and what we have. So we're not all living in a war zone. We're not all living in Darfur. But each and every day we live in communities that are broken. We live in communities where we don't talk to each other. We do take the path of least resistance, and yet life continues. And as you can see, and I'm an animal lover too. But yet our lives continue to be imperfect because we have these imperfect relationships with each other. And so I love working with communities and with schools, with teachers and with students. I love working with folks one-on-one who are realizing that, and often it's you hit the pinnacle of what you believe your career should be, and you realize that's actually not all that you are. And so I love working with people that are thinking about those things.
An empowering message.
Yeah, I'm a mom, which has been the absolute coolest, most challenging, just the most fulfilling thing that I've ever done. And every day it fills me with a lot of hope, but it also fills me with a lot of purpose. Like, it really, being a mother makes me want to do those things, like try harder when I feel like I can't do more, to do a little bit more. In part, it's the protective nature that parents have, that I don't want my children to have to fight the same fights because I fought them without courage, or I fought them not imperfectly, but I fought them in ways that allowed myself to kind of get off the hook. I'm not trying to leave them on the hook. I'm trying to leave them with a world where we've really transformed, really, frankly, to be a little woo-woo about it, our consciousness around a lot of issues. And so, yeah, that's who I am.
That's a lot.
I'm a huge Sting fan too. Like, there's so much to say. Yeah, it's great to be with you.
Neat. So for a little context for people who are listening audio only, there was the animal lover reference there was that Nicole's cat walked into the frame. The video users will see that, but I just wanted to make sure that that's spelled out. So being from Buffalo, I imagine your cold tolerance is such that if you and I are together and the temperature is dropping, I put a coat on before you do. Is that right?
Well, it's interesting because, so I think there are two types of Buffalonians. There's the type of Buffalonian that absolutely they can, jog with just shorts on when it's 30, 40 degrees. And then there are those of us who moved to warmer climates. And the first major move I made out of Buffalo was to South Africa. And I worked in South Africa at a law firm for a bit, but that was not warm enough. Some people think that South Africa is really warm. Actually, it's a pretty cold country, and it's got a pretty fierce winter. I moved to Haiti after that, and I was terribly excited for a number of reasons. But one of the things I loved about Haiti is it's just always warm. So I'm a Buffalonian that seeks out the warmest weather I can find.
Yeah, South Africa. I mean, that is pretty extreme latitude. Not necessarily extreme, but I mean, it would be probably comparable to some of the northern parts of the United States, I imagine. Southern, of course, but I imagine it's comparable if that's in my estimation from looking at a globe.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Johannesburg can get down to, in terms of Fahrenheit, can get down to 30 degrees easily during the winter, which is our summer. But South Africans, it's both like culturally and just, how the country's developed. They don't often have, even in, huge mansions, have central heating. So when it's cold, you're just cold.
Yeah. So human rights fights, right? That could mean a lot of things. What kind of things are you dealing with in your human rights efforts?
So when I first began focusing both kind of a lifestyle and activist life and a career around human rights, it was very much what people think of when they think of human rights. I joined an Amnesty International chapter, for example, in high school, and would write letters to despots demanding that people be released from prison for attempting to defend rights, attempting to speak out against injustice. And very soon, though, when I got to college, I realized that human rights, even though many people think, oh, well, we don't have to think about human rights in the United States, at least at that time, people didn't think we really needed to. I began seeing that there were human rights fights all over just my local community. And so I started working, for example, with women's groups to fight for women's reproductive health and reproductive justice issues. I began thinking a lot about, at the time, the first war in Iraq, and thinking about, like, what did that look like for civilians? What did it mean for us to go in and to kind of to bomb the country, but also to leave the country in a situation where civilians weren't able to provide for their basic necessities? As I went on and I began working, as I said, I worked in South Africa. In South Africa, I actually worked on the largest class action lawsuit that has ever taken place on the continent of Africa against De Beers, the Diamond people, for sulfur dioxide contamination. It was the first time that I realized that corporations sometimes had more power than the governments of the countries that they were working in. And sometimes corporations did look at the numbers and say, well, in this case, they thought there was a sulfur fire. They thought, well, if we let the sulfur fire burn, yeah, people will die and we'll pay out a little bit of money. If we try to put it out, though, that's going to cost a lot more. And so they made a cost-benefit analysis around what they were going to do. And so I worked on behalf of the people who lost their homes and their livelihoods and their family members and their health. There are many, many people who are just chronically ill from it. And just really learned just a lot about power and when power is wielded without justice, how inappropriate the results are. I went on to work on the genocide in Darfur, in the human rights atrocities that were taking place in Congo and in Colombia and in Haiti. And I did that for many years. And I met people. It wasn't, just the quote unquote Nelson Mandelas of countries that I met, although I did meet some pretty cool people like that. But I also just met regular, everyday people who were fighting for their rights. I also, interestingly, and I don't think folks always realize this with human rights people, I also met a lot of people that were, perpetrators of violence and violations of human rights. So I interviewed young men that were a part of paramilitary operations. I interviewed young men who had raped women, who had killed people, and it's really interesting when you begin to. So this was my job, and so I had to do the work. And as horrible as it was, and as ill-equipped as I felt, like I tried to do the best I could in those situations. But what I got out of it, and what I learned, is how easy it is for any of us to fall into a trap where we begin to believe rhetoric that is just not true, or we begin to hype ourselves up into believing that if we join a particular group, or if we have a particular ideology, or if we're lucky enough to be a part of a particular race or a part of a particular ethnicity, then we begin to believe that it is okay to do things to other people. And while people can look at Darfur and say, oh, that was so terrible, to bring it contemporarily, I look at the situation with DACA, with the deferred deportation of people who have been in this country since they were children, brought by their parents. And I hear people talk about how, oh, well, they were wrong, their parents were wrong, they're not a part of this country. And it's the same rhetoric that you hear in countries that, 15 years later have a massive human rights, just tragedy. And then everybody says, oh, how did that happen? Well, it always starts with the ability to dehumanize people. And I really learned that from talking with people that most people would try to avoid. I would say that now I kind of, quote unquote, retired just a bit from doing international human rights full time for a variety of reasons. But immediately when I did that, Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And I ended up going out to Ferguson, Missouri. And it was eerily similar to everything I had seen, name the country. The only difference was I spoke the language fluently, and there were Targets and Walmarts everywhere, which totally confused me the whole time.
It's a funny thing to notice, but it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to be in the backdrop of seeing, military forces instead, though we call them the police in riot gear, to see police in riot gear lined up against literally on occasion, women with strollers. Wow. And to see that, and to see literally signs of America behind it, still strikes me.
It's a remarkable observation. That's really interesting that you had that experience. I want to find out more about that because I think there's probably a lot to learn from that experience. But I want to back up to the interviews with the perpetrators of violence. What was the context of those? What were you? Why were you interviewing them? What was it for?
Sometimes it was for in some countries like Haiti, we did those interviews were done because we were mounting a case against former military and paramilitary. We needed to understand what had happened. In other countries like Colombia and Panama, it was a part of a peace process where they were, quote unquote, demobilizing paramilitaries. So folks who had been engaged in some of the most brutal, we don't talk about Colombia a lot in the United States, in part because we have so much involvement there. Yeah. But I'll say, as we were talking about internally displaced peoples, IDPs, refugees in Sudan, Colombia that whole time during that whole genocide had more internally displaced people than any other country on earth. And yet we didn't talk about it. We talk about the war on drugs, but we didn't talk about what the U.S. war on drugs in Colombia did to Colombia. And it propped up some really, hate to use the term, but some real bad guys, right? And it allowed for dysfunction in their justice system. And so during that demobilization, I mean, one of the things that we wanted to understand is, are these folks really demobilized, or were there exploits politically around the war on drugs just going to morph and transform into criminal activity?
Wow.
And we make this huge distinction between political acts, right? So if someone is like promoting genocide, it's seen as quasi-political. But when a criminal enterprise, we say, oh, that's criminal. Well, actually, those distinctions actually don't exist anywhere. Even here in the United States, when we think about cities that have a massive, quote unquote, gang problems, all of those origins, all the criminal enterprise and origins are derived from politics. Who has what, who doesn't have. It's interesting to work in countries where people don't have a lot, where the economies are not as complex as ours, where there just isn't just the wealth, the access, because things are so clear. You see so clearly that, yeah, so maybe this guy is the leader of a gang, but isn't he also the one that's bringing the medicine and the food to the elderly? I mean, it's just interesting. Here in the US, I think we sometimes think that we can be self-righteous about these things, and yet in countries like that, you can always be. And so, you know, really learning the human stories and having to overcome. For me, I had to really overcome. I come from a very religious, evangelical, conservative childhood and background. And so overcoming even, you know, the notions of good and evil that I didn't think I had, still almost on a daily basis, I have to encounter when I'm talking to people who, you know, maybe in the eyes of a lot of middle-class Americans would be considered bad guys. Sometimes I have to sit there and say, okay, but let's really talk about what your life looked like and what are the benefits that that you have brought to our society.
So well said. Yeah.
Yeah, Sister Jean, Sister Pre-Jean, who's done so much work around the death penalty, is really good at describing this, and has been a real inspiration to me as I think about how I talk with people who I view as being different from me. Because what I learn once you really get to know people, no matter, and sometimes it's really no matter what they've done, you realize like, oh, there's commonality. We still share a species, and I gotta own that. Yeah.
Every person has complex motivations, and I think what you said about the same person who is committing acts of violence and some things that are pretty heinous, also bringing the medicine and being, you know, that they value somebody and something. I was blown away listening to the Joe Rogan Experience. He had Megan Phelps Roper on the show, who grew up in the Westboro Baptist Church. That she's of Fred Phelps, right? And her description of her grandfather as, I think she called him Gramps or something like that, right? And it was such an endearing, you know, warm thing. And Joe Rogan was talking about the hatefulness, and she's like, well, you know what? I don't see them as hateful people. And I you know, really struck home to me that, you know, even the people in Charlottesville, right? I was listening to an interview with Christopher Cantwell, you know, one of the white supremacists, and I think he would accept that term, right? I think there are a lot of people that were there that might say, no, I'm not that, even though I'm, it's complicated, right? And I mean, you hear anguish in his voice, you hear a struggle, and you know, as much as, you know, I see these swastikas with these people walking, and it's just horrifying. I still, I mean, those people are human beings, even in the face of all that. And I think you really set something in motion there that I think can move people to try to, you know, as hard as it is to try to understand a white supremacist, I mean, they've been through things, and if you can find a little something from their perspective, maybe we can learn something about how somebody becomes something abhorrent, like we see there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think some of that I agree with. I think that for me, oftentimes, let me step back for a second. Oftentimes, because I do a lot of work around diversity and inclusion, people say to me, Nicole, you know, you're really easy to talk to. You don't get upset like other people. Other people, normally meaning other people of color, get upset when I say things that, you know, maybe normally people say, I say things that aren't politically correct. Often what they're really saying is when they say things that are racially insensitive all the way to racist. I think because of the work that I've done, I'm able to hear what people are saying and to understand their perspective and also completely reject it at the same time. And I think as that is not a skill that we cultivate in our society well. I think there are other societies that actually do a little bit better with that I can look, that I can hear what you're saying. I can know it's completely and utterly against my values. It's against what I believe in. And I can almost even look at you and say, and you know what? I've heard everything that happened to you in your life, and I think it's weak. I think your reasons for going there are weak. I can think all of those things and still have a conversation, in part because, frankly, that's what I'm trained to do, but also because I'm really secure in what I think and what I know and what I've seen. And I've had affirmation after affirmation. And instead of holding on to the conversation, I'm holding on to the things that I know. So for example, I know there's no one who can tell me different. I don't care. You could be a Harvard economist. You can't tell me that the smartest women, the smartest people in the world are not women that work in marketplaces in developing countries. You can't convince me otherwise. I know that they are the smartest. I know that women that work, that are market women, literate, not literate, whatever, are the smartest people on the planet. I know that. So one can come to me and say, oh, look at these people from developing countries and look at, you know, they just ask and want and need and blah, blah, blah. You can say all that to me and I can hear what you're saying, and I can hear that, oh, well, maybe this is coming from the fact that you're from a Rust Belt city like Buffalo and the factories have gone and you feel disenfranchised and you feel disempowered. I can hear all that and then also know also what you're saying is completely wrong because I've had other experiences that show me something really different. I think being able to walk that is very, very hard, especially for white people. I think it's especially hard when you have white people in your family, and you're talking, because we were talking about white supremacy, who are white supremacists, and you love them. Like you were giving the example of the Westboro Baptist Church. And that young woman knows the feelings and the beliefs that her grandfather has harmed people. And it is difficult to describe, and it's hard for people to maintain that I love you and what you're doing is super harmful. Also, it's really hard in this country for white people to know what to do with it. Like, so I can fight you every day, every time, every Thanksgiving, I can have a fight with my family. This is what people say, I can have a fight with my family. Where is that going to go? And where is that fight going to lead? And so the question is, how can we to me, the question is, how can we understand people and then really challenge them to be better and to do better and to think better? And then to the extent that that is not, does not breed change, at what point do you say, you know what, this is not the values that I hold? I have folks in my family, for example, that I find that are extremely homophobic, or maybe they wouldn't say, even they'll say to me, well, no, we're not afraid of gay people. We just don't like gay people. So okay, so then they're heterosexist, right? And so I can have conversations about that, but at a certain point, it's about, you can't come to my house talking like that. Sorry, my kids are not going to be subjected to that, right? Like, so it's just, it's a walk that we have to do as a society, and there's signs all around us that we're not having as many conversations as we need to have. But the question is, like, where do we learn the skills to be able to balance that the two? I love you, I honor you, I affirm you. What you believe is absolutely wrong, and I can hear you, but at the same time, I'm going to maintain that space.
Well said. Well said. I agree with that. I really like the idea that we can have different values and we can leave it at that. I think, you know, if your family members are you know, saying something along the lines of, well, we don't like homosexuals and therefore we must commit some kind of act of violence or any of those kinds of things, obviously there's more than just saying, okay, we have different values, keep it away from my home, right? That becomes something bigger. But I think we can get to that point that hey, you know, somebody that I know doesn't like black people. Okay, they don't associate with black people, and that's the end of it. There is a broad distinction there. It's where we become actively violent. Well, I guess maybe you might disagree with that, right? Is there a am I off on saying that there is a place where we can say, okay, we disagree, therefore we'll just part ways?
It really depends. And to me, I think it depends on who you're accountable to, right? So I have two children. They're 7 and they're 4, and they're amazing and cute and all the things. And they're also learning every day. So in the example that I gave, I'm really mindful about the messages that they get. I remember growing up and having adults say things that were racist or sexist or homophobic, and having my father say to me, well, we don't agree with that, so don't ever say that. And I think that was good. I think what's great is when we really make sure that we're surrounding our children with the most inclusive messages that we can, because we still live in a society. So that there's the parenting, like there's the ability for parents to have an impact, and I teach on this, like actually your impact kind of dies from about 10 to 24. So you got to get it in, right? From like 0 to 10, and then between 10 and 24, you're really just, kind of like living a message, if you will, trying to act and hope that they're watching. Sometimes they are, sometimes that they're not. And then at around 25, they start listening just a little bit again. And so thinking about the messages that we're sending. So not just, hey, we're not homophobic, but these are the people in our lives that we love, that represent different family structures. I think that that's really important as a parent. I think if you're raising children in the 21st century and you want them to be successful, 20 years from now, some of this is just not going to be okay. It's not okay now, and it's really not going to be okay. It's going to have an economic impact on your children if they're not able to be around people who are different from them. Yeah. Now, here's the thing. If you're just accountable to yourself, you have to decide what that looks like for you. So you might be able to maintain relationship without conflict with folks that do embody those isms. And that might be okay for you. I would suggest that for most people and for most clients that I've had and most people that I taught, at a certain point, you have a really racist cousin and you love them and you care about them, but yet that's something that's very prominent in their lives. And for most people who embody an ism, it is something that's fairly prominent in their lives. It comes up a good deal. That's going to start to wear on you.
Yeah.
And so the question is, if you're living the life that you were born to live, how much energy are you able to put into that relationship without being very, very clear about where you stand? And so it's complicated, because we do have to love folks that aren't where we are, right? We do. That is actually the call of being a part of community. And at the same time, we have to maintain a level of values for ourselves. It's actually, when people say, oh, well, my kids know, and just go back to kids for a second, my kids know what I think. They know we're not racist. They know we're not sexist. If you have people around them that are espousing those views, they actually really don't. Research is pretty clear on this. The kids listen to what you say, and then they look to how it's living out in their everyday life. So what the message that they're actually getting is, well, I'm not allowed to say that, but Uncle Joe is. Yeah. Right? It's not like they're not internalizing. They actually do internalize it. They decide for themselves. Some decide, yeah, Uncle Joe's totally right. And some kids decide, oh, Uncle Joe doesn't know what he's talking about. But that comes later. What they actually understand is, oh, there's actually these two sets of rules. There's one for me, there's one for Uncle Joe, there's one for mom and dad. And so that's a pretty confusing message when we live in a fairly multicultural, multiracial society. So it's tough. It's tough. I do encourage folks, like bring folks along, but understand that not everybody wants to be brought along.
Yeah, you can't fix people, I guess, is a big part of it, right? You can set an example of virtuous behavior in your own life and hope that other people will notice that, especially your children, right? The thing about rules, I guess, kids can see that, right? I think there is a lot of legalistic, right? These are the rules kinds of things. I think there's also a very valuable message to say that, despite his faults, we still love Uncle Joe and some of those things too. I think there's a message of love to be spread, and as much as there are abhorrent ideas out there, I think you might be able to get through to people with abhorrent ideas more with an olive branch than with standoffishness. Am I wrong about that?
I think it can go both ways. It's a toss up, which is why, again, it's, you know, the saying, a lot of coaches use it, a lot of everybody use it. You know, you put your own oxygen mask on first, right?
Yeah.
So there's a part of that is really important. And then if you have that empathy and that readiness to give to others who maybe have these abhorrent ideas, then yes, that's your call to do so. Know that exposing your children to that, though, they don't have a mask. They don't have the tickets. You have the tickets. You got on the plane. You brought them on the plane. They have no control over what they're hearing, and so that's where it gets a little bit testy. I mean, I think that yes, we do have to love our folks along. We also have to understand that it is not the job of just general community to do that. A part of, and I know we're going to talk about social justice probably, but this whole notion, let's put it this way. If we had waited for white folks in the South to be brought along to the idea of desegregation, I still would be drinking from colored water fountains.
I don't know that that's true, but
well,
it's a good point that moving forward requires action, right? And there is a battle to be fought.
But I think that a part of what we're seeing is, and you're probably very familiar with the statistic, when Martin Luther King died, his approval rate among white Americans generally was at 17%. Right? So it is not, inertia wasn't moving us. Inertia was not moving this country towards more freedoms for African Americans. And that, I mean, that's just what the science shows us. So then the question is, you know, do we also need to be pushing folks along? Is there a way that love also looks like saying that's actually not okay? That's not the values that we have, and we're going to need you to really rethink that. Like, and again, because I said that some cultures are really good at this. Like some cultures, some countries, folks are much better at saying, actually, these are the things that we don't believe in. Like these are the things we're not going to do. So we're not going to have sexism. We're not going to espouse racism. And that's just not what's going to happen. And yes, you'll have a minority of people say, well, no, that's what I'm going to think anyway. And that's fine, but it's not seen as acceptable. Where I think in the United States, we've run this line on ourselves that I think is really hard, which is we want everyone to have the rights to believe what they want to believe. Unfortunately, we don't say we want everyone to have the right to have the information that they need to develop, to develop an opinion that's informed. And so often a lot of the opinions that folks have, for example, immigrants are taking our jobs. We say everyone has a right to that opinion, but what we don't say is everyone has the right to the information, the education that would then show, okay, what does that actually look like statistically? Why did cities like Detroit and Buffalo and Cleveland lose jobs? Like, why is it? We don't believe everybody has a right to the information, because if we did, our education system wouldn't look the way it does. We wouldn't still pretend like a high school diploma is enough to survive in our society. There are ways in which this whole notion of we get to believe what we want to believe falls hollow for folks. I've spent a lot of time, frankly, in communities that are mostly white, that are mostly working class. And I find the commonalities that they have with all other working class people to be just astounding. Same concerns, same issues, sometimes even the same jokes. And yet there's this chasm of racism that does separate them.
Yeah.
And we have a real difficult time even just saying that.
There's no question that there is racism, and I think to a degree it's natural, right? We favor the people close to us, right? When I hear something like Black Lives Matter, right, and I think that's a complicated topic, and that organization is one thing, but right, just the statement Black Lives Matter. Well, yes, of course they do, right? They matter more to some people than others, right? And when I think about lives mattering to me, right, the lives of my children matter more than any other creature on the face of the earth, right? And I think everybody is going to feel that way. And if you extrapolate out, right, the people closest to you probably matter to you than somebody on some distant continent, and all of those kinds of things. And to draw the lines of what matters to you more than someone else along racial lines, I think is a faulty way of looking at things. But it is it's a superficial way that you might see that somebody with the same skin color as me might be closer to me in some sort of genetic sense, and it's probably natural to have some sort of inkling that this person is closer to me and therefore might matter to me more, whether consciously or unconsciously, right? I think there's a lot of natural reasons why that might be the case. And so, yes, racism is alive and well, and probably will always be. I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that, but I think there's probably, it's probably not something that is endable. But like you said, right, there's more that we have in common than that we don't. And back to, right, I mean, the causes for why jobs go away are complex. Right? You talk about the right to have the information. Well, there's a lot of information and a lot of causes and a lot of reasons, and understanding it is, I think it's beyond my capacity, right? I don't understand all the reasons why things change and some of those things. It is very easy to blame, right? There's the immigrants. There are the immigrants, right? That's plural. There are the immigrants. They are the cause, right? It's a lot harder to understand all of the many things that go into something. So, I mean, I think it's easy to say that people have a right to the information, but how do you interpret all that is I guess the hard thing, and people are going to come to different conclusions.
So research again is really clear on, when you talk about racism as being inherent to the human condition, the research is really clear that it's really bias, right? So issues of bias that are, you're right, absolutely a part of who we are, a part of our, very probably right down to our DNA. It's evolutionary. It is the way that we have evolved as a species, that we've been able to make quick decisions with a lot of information coming at us. So your brain receives every minute anywhere between 20,000 and 30,000 bits of information. Our ability to perceive what's important, what's not, what's dangerous, what's not, which plant is poisonous, which one's not. Is that a growl of a lion in the background, or is that the growl of a little tomcat in the background? All of that's very important. That has led us, to the wheel and to weapons and all sorts of things that have caused our evolution. Absolutely true. But racism is actually, you need a few more ingredients for racism, right? You really need systems. And so when people talk about racism, I think it's really important that we understand that we're actually talking about systems. We're actually not even talking about people's feelings, right? Feelings is really a issue of bias and prejudice. Racism needs institutions and systems to ensure that the patterns of bias and prejudice are affirmed and continued. And I think that that's really important. And even when you look at, because we were talking earlier about what folks have in common. So when you look at our move from slavery that looked like indentured servitude in the United States to chattel slavery and servants, right? So at a certain point, a determination was made that if we actually created a chattel slavery system that was only people of African descent, instead of also having a white servant system, that we could better control slavery. And there were all sorts of rebellions that prove that to the upper class, that, yeah, we probably do not need this alliance between white slaves, if you will, and black slaves, or white servants and black slaves. So that's racism, right? When you develop institutions and systems to make sure that people of different races are separated. I mean, that's a very real thing that we have to think about. Yes, I do think that it's important to note, and I think that people do this often when people say, oh, I want my child to be prepared, or I want to be prepared myself for a multicultural world. We try to move into multicultural environments. And that's so we move to big cities where there are people of different races and different religions and different ethnicities. Or we try to immerse our children into those areas, into areas that look like that. Certainly, if you grow up around one particular group of people, your proclivity is going to be to think that that group of people is a group of people you belong with. That's a group of people you agree with.
They're your people.
They're your people. That makes a lot of sense. If you grow up in a community that is diverse, your people is going to look more diverse, although it takes a couple more ingredients, but we can talk about those later. I think that there's either an inherent like revulsion at the notion of Black Lives Matter, or inherent affirmation of the notion of Black Lives Matter. And the revulsion, I think, in my estimation, for some, comes from this notion that, once again, we're being, quote unquote, left out. Again, without the information. I think that when I talk to people all over the country, people are stunned to find out that, for example, in this country, most people who are killed by police are white and men. And armed. let's just be real, and armed. The second most likely is African American, male, and unarmed. People are shocked by that discrepancy. One of the groups that is most likely to be abused by the police, meaning to be beat up by the police, is a white male teenager or young adult that is in the middle of a mental health crisis. So I meet with parents all over the country whose children have been paralyzed, whose children who have been further traumatized because of their interactions with the police that have happened in moments where they were in crisis, and they have gone very poorly. Now then, why do people say Black Lives Matter, and why does Black Lives Matter, why has that resonated? Because for centuries, this has been the experience that Black folks have had with the police. And no, it has not actually mattered to many, many people in this country. And that is both how it felt, but also, I'll say statistically, when people were polled about issues of police brutality all throughout the 50s and 60s, when literally police were letting dogs out on peaceful protesters, people were saying, oh no, that's not a problem, that's not an issue. And so that's why I go back to information. And yes, absolutely, I mean, we can have a whole conversation about news versus fake news and statistics versus whatever. I think that one of the biggest information gaps that we have is that folks don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
Right? So I could be in a white working class town and have a conversation with someone, and they'll say, oh yeah, the police really beat up that kid really bad, and yeah, he was a little quirky. Often this is what you hear from folks if someone has not had any treatment for mental illness. He was a little quirky, but wow, they didn't have to do that to him. And I can go to a Black neighborhood and hear the same thing. And so really the education deficit is not just on statistics and what's on the news. This is also about our inability to actually have conversations with each other about our shared experiences.
Yeah. I mean, the feathers ruffle and people take sides in these things, and you become the enemy when, in fact, right, just like you said there, right, so many victims of violence, we could get together behind, hey, these police forces, there are some problems, right? Whether and I don't know what the causes are, whether there is, I'm sure there are a lot of causes for why interactions are often going badly between the public and police officers. But yeah, talking about it is huge, and I'm grateful that you're willing to talk to me about these things. I think that this is a step in the right direction. I want to ask you. So you talked about your self-assuredness, right? That you're able to talk about things without losing your cool and letting that get in the way of having a real conversation, right? And that's vital to being the kind of patient educator that you are. How did you get that way?
I think around issues of difference and race, it really stemmed from my family background. So I am the child of two biracial parents. One side of my family, by appearance to many people, were white. And so when I was with them, my sister and I were really the only quote unquote Black people. And so the conversations that would ensue and the things that were said and both the ease and the uneasiness that would come up really shaped me from very early. So everything from comments about whether or not we should be in the sun too much, or, you know, how our noses were shaped, or, you know, just all sorts of like, you know, very like Lifetime movies kinds of things would happen.
Natural curiosity, right? I mean,
no, this is from adults. So no, I think more of concern, frankly, concern about our appearance, concern about what people would think about us, concern about us not kind of fitting in. And then from the other side of my family, who identified as Black, and inappropriately so, a ton of love, ton of devotion, and a lot of jokes and lightheartedness about how my sister and I looked, and kind of our makeup, and the other parts of our family. And so I think for me, this was always a conversation. There was always a conversation about certainly my ancestry and my identity. And so when that happens to a child around, just like children who have two moms or two dads, they're are pretty prepared by about 10 years old to have conversations about different family structures. I was really prepared, or more prepared, to have difficult conversations with folks that may not say the things that I want to hear, or may say things that I disagree with. And I think also working as an organizer and a facilitator around activist issues, but then also being a lawyer and working in human rights, and having to listen to tough things, hear people tell stories that were, you know, horrific, and hearing people say things that maybe I disagreed with or didn't disagree with, allows me to do it. But I think that the most important thing for me, and what I didn't have as a child that I think I've developed over time, is I am not afraid to say words or have conversations with people that make them uncomfortable either. And there's a part of that that is about love. Like I said, like love doesn't always look like agreeing. Sometimes it looks like disagreeing, but being able to say, like, we can sit in discomfort together and we can have this conversation. And also knowing that conversations aren't going to make or break me, meaning, so I can walk away from a conversation and feel like, oh my goodness, this person does not affirm my humanity or my experience. Like, they don't care that, for example, racism exists, or they don't care about sexism. That reality, that all might be true, that doesn't actually impact my personal bottom line, because I know that moving things into action and knowing that other strategies have to get us there in order to be free. Like, if I was worried about opinion polls, right, I would be pretty bad off if we start talking about like what people thought about, as I talked about before, the civil rights movement, or I thought about what people, you know, really thought about a number of things. I know that our conversations and our communications are really important. It's also what we do, and it's also about our commitments, like where our commitments lie.
That's neat. I mean, I'm afraid, right? I'm afraid of having uncomfortable conversations. I'm afraid of alienating all of the people that that I think like me, right? That they think like me by me saying the wrong thing, right? And I think that's something very real. And when I, you know, you mentioned social justice, and that was one of the things that I kind of prepared you for with this, was that I wanted to ask you about that term, because I do see that term on your about page as well. And I think a lot of my fear stems from that, right? If somebody says the wrong thing, there's not generally, from what I've seen in our societies, is there's not a gentle nudge of, hey, this is the wrong, the wrong side. I mean, people get called Nazis inappropriately. There's calls for, you know, you must be fired if you have the wrong opinion, and those kinds of things. And it terrifies me that I could be heading that direction if I slip up and say one thing that's not fully informed in light of, you know, the latest social justice trend. So to me, social justice is kind of a terrifying thing. What does it really mean?
For me, I mean, I actually think that it's kind of the crux of civilization, really, because what makes up a civilization, right? We all have to at least see the fundamental humanity in everyone, right? And I think social justice to me is the process, that is the fight for that fundamental, seeing that fundamental humanity in everyone. For me, though, fundamental humanity implies things like rights. It implies that one's basic needs can be met, that people can attain a level of contentment and happiness. That I think that all goes into social justice. I think I hear what you're saying, and I want to affirm the fact that there is a call out culture, meaning when someone says something wrong, they are called out. Often they are called out by people they don't know, especially if they say it on social media, right? That can be really disconcerting. I think that my work and my mission is to allow people to have space to have those genuine moments where they don't say the right thing and that they make actual mistakes. When I say actual mistakes, some of us hold opinions that we know probably don't fit, and I don't even want to say the norm, but actually don't fit the society that we live in, and we know it. And when we're called on it, we say it was a mistake. I am a person, and I've certainly done this with clients before, that say, I want you to own that. It's not a mistake. That's actually what you think, and you actually often can do better, right? So this whole notion of living our best lives means that sometimes we have to push ourselves beyond where our comfort level is, and often even beyond where our pain threshold is. And I really do ask people to do that. I think in parenting, like when we think about our children, and often children make mistakes around these issues, the reason why some people tell me they don't talk to their children about issues of race or about issues of sexism or ethnophobias is that they're afraid that their child will then say the wrong thing. And that's real too in our society, that we almost tell parents, like, don't say anything to your kid. We tell kids, don't say anything about anything. And then when they make a mistake, then yeah, oh my gosh, everybody's to blame. The kids to blame, the parents are to blame, everyone's to blame. There isn't a lot of space. There isn't a lot of room for the conversations. I agree with that. And I think that a part of my work is to create space for those conversations. So yeah. Having said that, though, let me say this, because I think that, you know, I'd love to affirm and to be, you know, really positive on all things. But here's the thing I find very interesting. Oftentimes people take to social media and they say super racist things, super homophobic things, super sexist things. You know, oftentimes when you, like, because you mentioned the example of someone and then they get fired, often the reason why they get fired is that they've proven themselves not mission fit to work where they work. And unfortunately for them, because we are in a multicultural, multiracial society, you can literally be, you know, working at Dunkin' Donuts, making coffee. And if you're racist, you're actually not mission fit for Dunkin' Donuts. I mean, this is, you know, everybody's like, always likes to talk about, like, let's live in reality. Let's be realistic. Dunkin' Donuts can't have, and I'm sorry, Dunkin' Donuts, if you're offended by me using me as an example, but Dunkin' Donuts cannot have people who are espousing racist views at their cashier, at the cashier. They just can't. And that's, again, like, so often I hear people say, oh yeah, you know, people are so sensitive and they want political correctness and all these things. It's like, but yet you can't control what you put on social media. And therefore now you don't have a job and you're whining. So there's a part of it to me is just like, okay, if everybody has to man up, if you will, woman up, then what does that look like for those who choose to make these statements in public?
Understood that. I mean, somebody who is, you know, participating in things, carrying a swastika and some of those things, right? I mean, that is toxic for your brand, and, you know, completely understood that you would not want that associated with your business. I completely agree with that. But there is a spectrum, right? And, you know, saying something that is racist, I think there are many degrees of that, and there are even places where interpretation, right? It is subjective as to whether something is in fact racist or you know, or a perceived slight, right? I don't want to minimize the fact, right? I mean, I do not dispute that there is real racism, but I think there is also such a thing as false accusations of racism, and people have lost jobs for things that they shouldn't have, right? I think that there is a very real.
I'm not aware of any. I would love, like, if you have those, I'd love to, because I don't know of any I can't think of any, and I follow these a lot because it's a part of my work. I'm trying to think of a situation where someone has lost a job where they haven't said something that was, that wasn't actually racist. I mean, what I see more of is people, something is said on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and then there is this effect where people then say, like, this is wrong, and they give all the reasons, and then sometimes they'll give articles, oftentimes they'll give articles. And I think that there are better ways, if people truly are engaged, there are better ways to have those conversations. Oftentimes the question is, the person who said it, do they actually, so let's say someone says something that shows a racial prejudice. Perhaps it's not so obvious that it's racist, but it shows a racial prejudice. Is that person willing to learn? I mean, that's the other part of it. Because so often people who are expressing themselves through a dominant identity, right? So let's say as a straight person, let's say I go on and I say, well, I don't know what the problem is. You guys have marriage. Now you have marriage equality. Just be quiet, right? I could say that. There would absolutely be a piling on, right? Probably from quote unquote social justice folks. Am I willing to hear them? Am I willing to have a conversation? Am I willing to engage that maybe from my point of privilege, I don't see the whole picture, that I don't see the whole perspective? And I think oftentimes, I mean, that's where the crux is. If you're willing to see it, if you're willing to have a conversation, sometimes it can be of benefit. But very often people espouse views about identities they don't hold, and then expect there to be almost the same level of flippancy as that they used when they said it. They think that same level of, oh, well, kind of just like, what's the big deal, should be provided to them. And it never works that way.
I think you're talking about flippancy in terms of like maybe a joke or something, right? That they don't really hold such and such view, but they're making some joke because they think it's funny, and it's clearly jokes can hurt, and that's
sometimes it's jokes. Sometimes it's jokes, but sometimes it's it can be a statement around someone's identity that then they'll say they didn't really mean. I'm sure you've seen this on Facebook. People say, oh, I didn't really mean that. And it's like, yes, but it was said. So they expect that it will be received at the same level in which they meant it. And yet, so very often, it hits folks that are actually dealing with a real issue. Like, one shouldn't make genocide jokes, right? Like, everybody knows that. One shouldn't make genocide jokes. But it's almost like if someone who's actually experienced a genocide comes back and says, hey, that's actually not funny. And the person says, well, why are you piling on me? There's a question around, like, what is, if you had no particular interest or stand on it, or no particular hand in it, then why are you saying it?
Sure. Some sensitivity goes a long way.
Yeah, that's where people don't take responsibility, and that's where I think it's harder to sympathize.
Sure. Yeah. If somebody calls you out and says, hey, that was a bad thing that you did, and you say, well, oh, I didn't mean it that way. Trying to make amends and clarify what you did mean. I think that should go a long way. I'm not sure it always does. I think that there is a kind of an angry pitchfork and torches mob kind of a culture around matters of social justice, and it's kind of a get 'em kind of a thing. And and even too, right? I mean, the desire for somebody to lose their job is something that I don't understand, right? I mean, understood that, if you have somebody that doesn't represent your brand well, you want to get rid of them as a business. But the insistence on, I'm going to contact your employer and get you fired is something that I don't get.
Yeah, I can't say that I've engaged in any of that myself personally, but I absolutely understand. To be really honest with you, I understand why. And so let me provide this perspective. As an African-American woman, I just came back actually from a trip where I was driving with another African-American woman. And we really had to think about where we were going to stop, like where we were going to stop to eat, where we were going to stop to use the bathroom, where we were going to stop to use gas, to get gas for the car. We had to really think about it, because at all times in my life, my personal life experience, I have had to be on guard with people who would potentially hurt me because of my race. And from a perspective, I'll give you the African American perspective or a person of color perspective. From a person of color perspective, I know, like, many people were surprised to see folks with tiki torches descending on Charlottesville, and to find out that these were, from blue collar to white collar, people with jobs. African Americans weren't, because we know we encounter people like that all the time that, yes, fit right back into society, no problem, but have these very, very dangerous views about our humanity. As a woman, I absolutely have to be on guard, because I know that there are men. It's a very interesting link between neo-Nazis and the men's rights movement that people really need to look at. I am aware that I have to be on guard. My friends who are gay and lesbian, they know as well. There are people who mean them harm. If you know that there's someone actually like that, and yes, and they're working in the world and they're working at places of business, absolutely, you don't want to encounter them, nor do you want anybody that you know to encounter them.
I
For
guess
many people, this is actually, it's actually not, it does not stem from from vengeance. Yes, I have seen vengeance. Absolutely, I'm not going to deny that there isn't that aspect on occasion, but it actually doesn't stem from vengeance. It stems from the fact that overall, there are people in the society who live under conditions that are consistently insecure. And to know that there are, and to be able to identify who those people are that make your life insecure, yeah, you're going to say, I shouldn't have to walk into Dunkin' Donuts and see that person. And no one should.
I think that can be understood, right? I think there is a line there, and yeah, I think there, from my perspective, it looks like a lot of the things that I see as far as social justice attacks are more vengeance than they are trying to protect themselves and others in their communities. But I don't think that we're necessarily going to agree on that. But I think your perspective is well stated, and I think that, yeah, to the extent that it is intended as protection, I can get behind that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I think that more and more groups in this country will come to recognize that some of this is more important as things begin to impact them.
Yeah.
When it impacts you, it's pretty clear.
Yeah. I think that makes sense, right? And so the tiki torches, right? To me, that looks like some goofy gimmick. And tiki torches, it seems so silly, but I've heard it asserted that that's, a threat, right? Burning synagogues and black churches and kind of things is the intent of carrying those things. Is that the way you take it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's gimmicky only if it's a gimmick of reviving the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi Party. If folks are walking down the street, well, first of all, if 10 people of color got together walking down the street with tiki torches, there would have been a major problem. And yet this was allowed with hundreds of people walking by a church where my legal colleague and some of the clergy that I know best in the world were in the church and were terrified. And these aren't people that scare easily. Walking by a synagogue, yelling nasty, absolutely anti-Semitic slogans. So it's gimmicky until it's not, until it's actually in your face. And again, this is we love to other in this country and say, oh, these things that have happened in other places could never happen to us. That's pretty much hallmark Nazi Germany, hallmark pre-Rwandan genocide kind of moves. No, I found it to be completely disgusting. I believe even the harassment of people on that night was a hate crime, and inevitably led to the violence that happened the next day. That was inevitable. And I don't find it to be quirky. I don't find it to be weird. I don't find it to be silly. I find it to be a hate crime.
It is a threat, right? So yeah, I guess that's the way it was probably intended to be a threat. I mean, I don't know what was going through the minds of those people, but I mean, I don't really know what was going through the minds of those people anyway. But so yeah, understood that's a threat, and it's ugly, and so how do we heal, right? How can we get together to try to create a better world?
I'm a big fan of, really thinking about truth and reconciliation, just like in South Africa after apartheid, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which, was not perfect, but it did a couple things I think are so important that we need. And first, I think we need the truth. And we have a really hard time in this country telling the truth about what's happening. We have a really hard time calling things what they actually are. What went on in Charlottesville is dangerous and shouldn't be tolerable in our country. And yet we, even the president tried to create this moral equivalency that is just absolutely abhorrent. For me, my truth is I believe in human rights. I believe that each and every person deserves dignity. And so because of that, we do have to tell this truth about the history of this country and be willing to talk about it. And it's funny because my husband spends a lot of time in Germany. He's always talking about when you're in Germany, they're constant reminders of the Holocaust, constant. They'll show the plaques of just brave Jewish folks and their allies that tried to stop the Holocaust. There's no like, there were, two sides to every story. No, it's just what it was. And we need to do that in our country. We every day teach our children things that kind of don't make sense to them. We don't talk about the fact that we've basically eradicated the native population of this country. We don't talk about the fact that slavery in the United States, in the Americas, was one of the most abhorrent systems ever created. We don't talk about the vestiges of that. We're not willing to tell that truth. Until you're willing to tell the truth, you're not going to have the level of reconciliation that we need. And so I think that there needs to be a common understanding of what has gone on in this country. We don't necessarily have to have a common understanding of how we heal because we're all going to heal differently. But we do need to have a conversation about really what the truth is and what as a nation we really value. So if we value liberty and justice, then why are we kicking out kids that have been in this country their whole lives? If we really value the rule of law, then why aren't police trained to the point where they're able actually to follow the rule of law themselves? Like, we need to be able to be consistent with our values. And I think that's how we get there. I think, most folks, given guidelines, parameters, and information, want to get along. They want to get along with their neighbors. They want to get along in their community. Even in that, we have to be able to be honest. Like, where does the economic power lie? Why is it that our Rust Belt cities look the way that they do? Like, let's be honest. Let's not scapegoat, but let's be honest and let's figure out what we need to do next.
I like that not scapegoating part. I think that when I try to understand, right, where did Nazi Germany come from? It's a task that you can't understand. But the best explanation that I can find that I've read was blame. Right, the pushing of Bolshevik Jews as the cause of the ills of the problems that there were in the cities in Germany, and that was what shaped Hitler's views toward that Jews were to blame. And I worry about blame. I worry about some of the elements of social justice blaming white males for a lot of problems. That might be a source of something similar. And so you
believe that the blaming of white males is equivalent to blaming Jews?
No, I'm not saying equivalent. I'm saying that it might be something on the same spectrum.
Yeah, I think to be really honest, David, I think it would be really great. I mean, since you're doing this podcast and you've said that the intention of the podcast is to create harmony, I think you should definitely consider how dangerous that statement is. White men are not in danger in this country. They are not in danger, and they're not being scapegoated. There's a difference between asking people to be accountable for what has happened versus scapegoating. And so I'm just truly uncomfortable with trying to conflate the two, because that's actually very similar to some of the rhetoric that went on in Nazi Germany, that somehow or another that the real victims were just most of the population, the majority of the population, the people that actually held the power. And in the United States, still, white people, white males, white heterosexual males hold a significant amount of power. They hold a significant amount of power in the Senate. They hold a significant amount of power in the House of Representatives. I think I'd love you to go look at the Supreme Court. I'd love you to look at every single president except Barack Obama. I think that's very dangerous.
I do not dispute that there is a lot of power that is held by people of a certain profile. And
you mean white males? White
yeah,
males,
yeah,
those
yeah,
people that are
absolutely.
being scapegoated by social justice advocates.
Absolutely. And really, I think there's way too much power by individuals, not individuals, organizations anyway, right? I don't like people having power over other people to begin with. So no, I agree with you that that it's not an imminent threat that white males are in danger of being overrun by something nefarious. I do worry about blaming people based on characteristics that they can't control, and I think that that's something that you and I certainly agree on, right? And I worry about putting too much blame on somebody because they are a white male or something along those lines. And I think that's something that I see from a bit of the social justice. I think treat people like individuals is the thing that I want. And
can you be more specific though? Because it's interesting. I've been involved in the social justice movements in the United States for the last 20 years, and I've stood next to white males within that every single social justice movement. I'm just trying to understand where you believe that scapegoating from the social justice world comes from.
I would need to put in some efforts to come up with specific examples. I know
Okay.
that seeing videos of screaming mobs, and you're a white male is kind of one of the.
Who's done that?
I don't have specifics on that. I am speaking of general anecdotes, and I don't know that represents the social justice movement as a whole. It's.
I mean, I'm not sure that it even represents the social justice movement as in part or in minority. That would make our movements awfully. It'd make them a little more sparse. Let's put it that way. I think that what you're quoting is quotes of quotes that come from fake news.
Well, I'm not talking about.
I've not had that experience.
YouTube videos of people screaming in mobs, and so no, I don't think that represents what you think. I think there is danger in blaming people, and there are people who do nefarious things, no question, right? But I don't want to impugn anyone. Is really all I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that there's a difference between scapegoating and calling for accountability. And calling for accountability is extremely important and has been important in virtually every peace deal, peace talk, healing, if you will, of a country. Accountability is extremely important, and accountability looks like a scapegoating when people don't want to be accountable, or that people feel like it's that when people don't want to be accountable.
Okay, agreed. Yeah. So I think you've challenged me, you've made me uncomfortable, and I appreciate that. And I will be thinking a lot about the things you've said. And yes, I do agree. It is dangerous to take on an identitarian view, and that's certainly not my intent. I do not. In fact, I'm a mixed race person as well, and I have no intent of saying that I'm not on board with the Charlottesville marchers or any of those kinds of things. Not at all. I don't want to give that impression one bit. So I just, I think we're in agreement, and I will take your advisement that is a dangerous tack, and I understood, right?
Well, no, I mean, I think that conversations like this are important, and I think that we all do have so much more in common in terms of what we believe than we don't apart. But it is the separateness, like there is those lines that I think, especially now with the political rhetoric being what it is, and I personally think it's so dangerous, frankly, some of it. I think that we do have to come to some shared agreements and some shared commitments about how we want to see this country move forward.
Yeah. Well, I admire you, and I appreciate you taking the time to share your views and your experiences, and it's a wonderful thing, and I'm glad that we can talk like this.
Me too. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.